Hi everyone, my name is Shiba and I'm a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania. Today I want to tell you about my work on third-party data providers and how they're going to bring simple mechanism. This is joint work with Yang Kai, Federico Echenique, Hufu, Katrina Leggett, and Adam Morman. So first, let me give you some motivation for this problem. So we know that nowadays, a lot of data is being produced and gathered every day. For example, many apps, many social media platforms are going to gather data of other users. And then a lot of this data is going to be sold or exchanged. This use and this exchange of data is giving rise to many new challenges. And one of those challenges, which is the one that I want to talk about today, is how this data is going to inform and affect behavior in strategic settings. More precisely, today I want to ask a question of how information asymmetries are going to affect auctions and mechanism design. And this is a very natural question to ask because such information asymmetries are present in many practical and real-life settings and real-life auctions. One typical example of such auctions with information asymmetries, which is worth hundreds of billions of dollars every year, is ad auctions. So the general setting of auctions with information asymmetries that we're going to look at today is the following. On the one hand, we have a seller that has items for sale. On the other hand, we have buyers who want to buy those items. And the seller is going to run a mechanism or an auction to sell his items to the buyers. Now the information asymmetries are going to come in the fact that the buyer is going to have incomplete information about the item for sale. And the motivation for this is once again ad auctions. In ad auctions, you can see the buyer as being the advertiser who is trying to show an ad to a target audience. And to do so, the advertiser is going to bid on an ad slot on, let's say, Google. But the advertiser is uncertain about who is going to see the ad and whether he's going to reach a relevant target audience and relevant users. Note that obviously in such settings in real life, the buyer or advertiser is not going to be bidding completely blind. Generally, the buyer is going to have access to third-party information on the item type. For example, for ad auctions, you could imagine that this information is going to come in the form of cookies or cookie data that give information about the user who's going to see the ad. And the question that I want to ask today is, what effect is this third-party information going to have on auction design? And I also want to ask how simple mechanisms that can be run in practice perform in the presence of such third-party information. Here is the model that we're going to look at today. On the one hand, we're going to restrict the seller to selling a single item, but this item can have n possible types. On the other hand, we are going to assume that the buyer, or advertiser here, does not actually know the item type. He only has a prior pi on this item type in the form of a distribution. And then the buyer is going to have a valuation for each item type, which is going to be taken from a known distribution. This distribution is known to everyone, including the seller. And finally, the buyer, so those valuations may be different for different item types, but importantly, the buyer is going to have independent valuations for different item types. And in the middle, we have a data provider. This data provider is going to be able to see information about the item type And this data provider will enter a contract with the buyer and reveal partial, possibly not necessarily all information that she has, but she can reveal partial information about the item type to the buyer. Now we're going to take the point of view of the seller, and we're going to ask the question of how to maximize the revenue from selling the item to the buyer. So previous work has studied this problem, but in the absence without a data provider. And so this problem has been studied at EC16 by Kostis Daskalakis, Christos Papadimitriou, and Christos Tsavos. And what they show is that the optimal mechanism design in this setting in which there is no data provider and there is a single item for sale, but the type of this item is unknown, basically reduces two mechanisms designed for the classical problem of multi-item auctions, where you can have multiple items, but each item has a known type. And one of the major implications of this work is that optimal mechanism design is hard in the setting with a single item and unknown types. It is hard first because the mechanism designer is going to have to use lotteries and randomization. So those mechanisms, the optimal mechanism is going to be impractical. But also the optimal mechanism is going to ask the buyer to choose among many lotteries, possibly infinitely many of them. So the optimal mechanism is generally intractable. However, when you combine the results of Daskalakis et al. With the results of Babayov, Imrolika, Lucier, and Weinberg that was published at Fox 14, you can show that in this setting, simple mechanisms are still going to do well. What I mean by this is that the better of two very simple mechanisms is going to yield a constant approximation to the optimal revenue. And when I'm saying constant, I mean constant in the number of possible item types. Those two mechanisms are the following. The first one is item type pricing, in which the seller is first going to reveal the item type I to the buyer and offer this item type at a price P of I. And then the buyer will decide whether he wants to buy the item type, which is I, at price P of I. And so in this item type pricing setting, the buyer knows exactly what item type he's buying when he's making his decision of whether to buy the item. The other simple mechanism is item type bundling, in which case the seller is going to offer the item at the price P without revealing any information to the buyer about the type of the item. Then the buyer is going to decide whether he wants to buy the item at price P, and only then the seller is going to reveal the item type to the buyer. So in this mechanism, the buyer buys first and only learn what he bought after he bought it. Now, in our work, remember that the main difference with the work of Daskalakis et al. Is that we have a third-party data provider that can reveal information about the item type to the buyer. And in our setting, the news are bad in the sense that we show that those simple mechanisms, so the better of item type pricing and item type bundling, cannot yield a constant fraction of the optimal revenue. We can, in fact, only get a log fraction of the optimal revenue. And here I mean log in the number of types. And then we further show that even if we extend our class of simple mechanisms to a more general class that is called item type partition mechanisms, this is not going to help, and we are still not going to be able to obtain a constant fraction of the optimal revenue via the simple mechanisms. So now let's go through some intuition of that first result. To prove the result, we're going to use the following construction. we will have m squared item types. Those m squared item types are going to be divided in m groups of m items. And the buyer's valuation for an item type in group 1 is going to be IID for all the item types in group 1, and is going to be taken from an equal revenue distribution, just renormalized by 1, so the identity of the group. In group K, it's going to be the same idea. The valuations for the item types are going to be IID, and they're going to be taken from an equal revenue distribution, renormalized once again by the identity of the group, so renormalized by K. And we're going to have m such groups. Now the information that is going to be available to the data provider and that the data provider is going to reveal to the buyer is going to be exactly what group the item type belongs to. And not to show that simple mechanisms are going to not perform well in our setting, we are going to leverage properties of the equal revenue distribution that were shown by Sergio Hart and Noam Nissan in 2012. The first such property is that if we do item type pricing with the equal revenue distribution, we are going to get low revenue. And what I mean by low revenue, I mean that in group K, where the ER distribution is renormalized by K, the revenue that one can get is only 1 over K. The second, now I'm going to look at item type bundling, and the second property that I'm going to use that also has been shown by Hart and Nissan is that if you do item type bundling and you set a price of the order of log n over j, then you will capture a revenue of log n over j for the groups that have renormalization factor less than j. So for the groups 1 to j. But the revenue for the groups k that have an index higher than j, and so that have a valuation that is renormalized by a bigger factor, are going to yield low revenue. And basically, the buyer in the setting is not going to be willing to buy at those prices. So here we're going to have a trade-off. We can set a fairly high price and get a lot of revenue from few groups, or we can get a lower price and get revenue for more groups, but this revenue is going to be lower. And what we show is that there is a poor trade-off between those two extremes. There is a poor trade-off between having a high price and capturing revenue from many groups. On the other hand, we can show that the optimal mechanism is going to be capturing the optimal revenue from all groups and do much better than just item type pricing and item type bundling. So that was the proof idea for the first result. Today, I'm going to skip on the proof idea for the second result because it's a bit more involved. But basically here, for the proof to work, we are going to require some randomization in the signaling scheme that the data provider uses to reveal information to the buyer. And in turn, the analysis is going to be more involved. And so that's all I wanted to talk about today. So thank you, everyone, for listening to my talk.